The Mandalorians and the Jedi. Two of Star Wars' most iconic factions that have both shaped the galaxy for thousands of years, but beneath it all was a dark and brutal past. A hatred that was formed between the two that has carried on throughout generations, leading to many deaths. But why did they hate each other so much, and what was the real cause for all of this? Well, in this video, we're gonna unravel that mystery and share why the Mandalorians and Jedi truly hated each other. So let's get right into it. The culture. Now, to understand the root of why these two hated each other, we first need to explore the different beliefs between the two, which were very different. The Mandalorians valued honor, strength, clan loyalty, and independence. On top of that, they glorified combat and fighting on the battlefield to protect their people. To them, nothing was more valuable than honor, and to sit among the best, you needed to prove just that. However, the Jedi were the complete opposite. They valued selflessness, peace, and of course service to the Republic. From younglings to Padawans, all the way up to the ranks of knights and masters, peace and justice was taught within the temple and was the main focal point of every Jedi's learnings. It's what made the Jedi themselves, and without it they would have no identity. However, because of these two different beliefs, there was much disagreement between the Mandalorians and Jedi. Each side saw the other's morals and foundation as flawed. The Mandalorians saw the Jedi's culture as if they believed they were superior, and as if their way of teaching was the only path in this world. Now, of course, being a warrior-focused culture like them, you can imagine they don't respond well to being morally lectured, so this makes sense. As for the Jedi though, they saw the Mandalorians as nothing but aggressive and just hungry for war. In their eyes, they were the peaceful ones, while the Mandalorians were the aggressors, and because of these two different philosophies, this is now where the hate for one another started. As time went on though, the Mandalorians began to grow in numbers, and well, as you can imagine, the Jedi weren't happy about this. Although they were still a small group at this time, the Jedi didn't want them to grow anymore, so they started to consider them a threat. In their eyes, the Mandalorians could one day be a danger to their peaceful Jedi Order and Republic. However, they had no idea what was about to happen next. The Wars. Around 4,000 years before A New Hope, there was a large galaxy war called the Great Sith War. Now, just hearing this title, you'd think that this would only be between the Jedi and Sith, right? Well, wrong. Actually, the Mandalorians played a crucial role in this war, but let's just say the result wasn't so pleasant. See, at one point, there was a former Jedi who later became a Sith named Exar Kun. Then, Kun's apprentice actually defeated the Mandalorian leader at the time and forced the rest of the Mandalorians to join them in war. Then, after losing their leader and being manipulated, the Mandalorians at the time agreed and joined the Sith to fight against the Jedi and the Republic. However, this is now where things escalated. Because of all this, it marked a turning point for the Jedi, since now they were no longer peacekeepers, but they too were at war, and this marked their first true fight against the Mandalorians. This war ended up lasting for about 2 years, and in time many Mandalorians and Jedi were killed, but eventually the war did come to a close. After a final battle on the planet Yavin 4, the Jedi and the Republic were victorious, and the Sith and Mandalorians were defeated. However, things were far from over. Over the next 20 years, the hatred between the Mandalorian and Jedi only got worse. Over these years, the Mandalorians were in a rebuilding phase, but throughout it there were many cultural clashes between the two, as well as moral conflicts. However, these conflicts only escalated as time went on, which eventually led to another war, the Mandalorian-Jedi War. Unlike the previous war we spoke about, this one lasted 16 years, and let's just say it was absolutely deadly. Throughout these years, thousands and thousands of both Mandalorian and Jedi were killed, but throughout it all, something crazy happened. During the early years of the war, the Mandalorians were struggling, so they had to find a way to compete with the Jedi. In their eyes, the Jedi's sorcerer-like ways and force abilities were too much of an advantage, so they had to hold their own. As a result, they started creating and building their own unique Mandalorian armor. This armor was purposely made to combat against the Jedi's force powers and lightsabers, and so they primarily used Beskar material. Beskar armor gave them a huge edge on the battlefield, and in time they even started incorporating advanced technology like jetpacks, flamethrowers, and specialized helmets. All of these things helped the Mandalorians hold their own, and while it was effective for 16 years, but sadly not effective enough. After years and years in fighting, the war finally came to a close on the Mandalorians' home planet, Mandalore. However, in this battle, the Jedi were able to overpower the Mandalorians, and as a result, Mandalore was scorched into a barren white desert. With that, their ancestral home was destroyed, thousands of their people were killed, and many warrior clans were completely wiped out. From that point on, Mandalore was never the same, and the battle left the planet environmentally ruined and politically fractured. Because of the Jedi, almost all of Mandalorian civilization was nearly wiped out, and although many thought it would be the end of the Mandalorians, they weren't quite done fighting yet. The Rebuild. After this brutal loss, the Mandalorians had two options. Accept their defeat and let Mandalorian tradition die with them, or rebuild. Let's just say though, defeat was not an option for them. In time, the Mandalorians worked on rebuilding themselves, and this was mainly thanks to the former Jedi Tar Vizsla. Vizsla was the very first Mandalorian Jedi, and after being trained in the ways of the Force, he quit the Jedi Order and returned to his homeworld of Mandalore. After doing so, he used his powers to unite the Mandalorian clans by creating what was called the Darksaber. The Darksaber became a symbol of leadership amongst the Mandalorians and united their people all together. Whoever held this saber would be pronounced the ruler of Mandalore, and Tar Vizsla would just be the first of many. Over thousands of years, many different rulers held the Darksaber and controlled Mandalore, but throughout it there was still much conflict between the Mandalorians and Jedi. The Mandalorians would never forget what the Jedi did to their homeworld, and as for the Jedi, they never wanted to see the Mandalorians as a threat against their power ever again. However, this cycle of violence between the two would eventually stop. Kind of. Centuries later, when Duchess Satine Kryze rose to power in Mandalore, she wanted to change the culture completely. In her eyes, she hated the idea of war and wanted to end this ever-longing conflict between the Jedi and the Mandalorians. To her, violence was wrong, and the Clone Wars was a prime example of that, as it could all be prevented through peaceful negotiations. However, she had no idea what was coming for her next. As a result of her beliefs, a group called Death Watch was created by Tar Vizsla's ancestor, Pre Vizsla. Pre Vizsla openly blamed the Jedi for the Mandalorians' sufferings and viewed the Jedi as the ones who shattered Mandalore's warrior golden age. So he and Death Watch refused to follow Satine's leadership, and well, many Mandalorians joined their cause. More and more, the hatred for the Jedi continued for the Mandalorians, and as you can see, it carried for centuries. However, throughout the Clone Wars, there was one Mandalorian warrior that broke this tradition, and that was Bo-Katan Kryze. Bo-Katan, who was sisters with Duchess Satine, witnessed the horrors that Death Watch was committing, and even more than that, she also witnessed Darth Maul rise to become the leader of Mandalore himself. Because she refused to allow a non-Mandalorian to rule Mandalore, she decided to fight back. In a rare act, Bo-Katan actually teamed up with the Jedi and the Republic to regain control of Mandalore, and well, it worked. In time, Maul and his servants were defeated, and Mandalore was reclaimed to its glory. This was really rare, because like we just mentioned, many of the Mandalorians hated the Jedi, and so kept that grudge even centuries later, but Bo-Katan broke that tradition. Because of the Jedi's help, Mandalore was reclaimed and united with its people again, or at least that's what they thought. The Fall. After the events of Order 66 and the rise of the Galactic Empire, we witnessed the collapse of the Jedi Order. As a result, nearly 10,000 Jedi were killed and the Jedi Order was truly gone. However, the Jedi weren't the only ones to suffer under the Empire. At one point, Mandalore suffered what was called the Night of 1,000 Tears. This horrific act led by the Empire completely decimated Mandalore by bombing the planet, shattering its domed cities, and hunting down any survivors. This night completely destroyed the Mandalorian civilization, and those who did survive were forced to go into hiding. As a result, Bo-Katan also lost control of the Darksaber, and Mandalore was truly destroyed at this time. For years following this, it seemed like the Mandalorian culture would never be united again, but eventually in time they were able to rebuild once more. With the help of Din Djarin, Bo-Katan, and many other Mandalorians, Mandalore was able to fight back against the Imperial remnants and take back what was theirs. Now, from what we know, Mandalore is currently reclaimed by its people, and the Mandalorian culture is slowly but surely rebuilding. At this point now, you can see how much the Mandalorians went through, war after war after war, all for centuries. As a result of the Empire destroying Mandalore, they became Mandalore's new #1 enemy, and the relationship between the Jedi and the Mandalorians kind of improved. Not a ton, but over the years there were a lot of Mandalorians who forgave the Jedi for what happened, and many let go of those grudges. Although they were aware of what happened thousands of years ago, they chose not to focus on that, and rather focus their efforts on their hatred for the Empire instead. However, there are some who still honor Mandalorian history, and will never forgive the Jedi as long as time exists. But with that, that concludes the history between the Mandalorians and the Jedi, and why they hated each other so deeply. But I want to know from you, if you were in the Star Wars universe, what would you rather be? A Mandalorian or a Jedi? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and may the Force be with you always.